The first time I heard the ocean whisper my name, I knew the rules weren't just superstition. Out here on the oil rig, where steel groans against endless black water, survival depends on remembering every single one of the 11 rules they drilled into us. The veterans swore they weren't warnings, they were lifelines. I remember the first night I broke one, thinking it was harmless, and what rose from below still keeps me awake years later. There are things in the deep that don't forgive mistakes, and now I can't stop wondering what will happen when the last rule is finally broken. When I first joined the rig, the veterans gathered us in the mess hall and spoke about things that sounded like drunken folklore. They told us about the sea watching, listening, and waiting. That was when they shared the first rule: never lean over the railings at night. I thought it was a warning about accidents, maybe to keep rookies from slipping into the waves. But later, when I stood there with the black horizon stretching forever, I understood there was more behind that warning than safety. The ocean at night was not silent. It breathed. That's the only way I can explain it. You could feel the swell of something vast, pressing against the metal beneath your boots, as if the rig itself floated on a chest too massive to comprehend. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself the creaks were just steel under pressure. Yet when the water churned without wind, when the surface swirled like something was shifting far below, the first rule began to feel less like caution and more like a plea. I remember one night when Darren, another newcomer, came to the deck with me. He was a skeptic, the kind who laughed at every whispered warning. "What's the worst that can happen?" he said, gripping the railing and leaning forward as though daring the sea to react. I wanted to stop him, but fear of looking weak held me back. His laughter echoed across the waves until something darker swallowed the sound. His face changed, pale and confused, like he'd heard something only he could understand. He staggered back, swearing under his breath. "Did you hear that?" he asked me, though his voice cracked in a way that wasn't like him. I told him no, but his eyes darted from shadow to shadow, as if voices lingered around the rig. That was the last time Darren joined me outside after dark. He never admitted what he heard, but every night after that, he closed his cabin door before the sun disappeared, locking it like a child afraid of monsters. Only here, the monsters weren't imaginary. Over time, I noticed patterns. When the rookies arrived, the ocean always tested them, almost like it knew who would be reckless. The ones who leaned over the railings, who mocked the rules, were always the first to change. They'd wake up at night, sweating, muttering half-formed words about voices in the water. They avoided the deck, avoided even glancing at the black expanse that surrounded us. Some requested transfers. A few went home early, claiming illness. Nobody pressed them for details, because the veterans didn't want us asking questions they already knew the answers to. One stormy evening, I was on night watch. The wind whipped across the rig, and the sky tore open with flashes of lightning. I was supposed to check the equipment, but when I passed the eastern platform, I saw movement. A figure leaned out over the railing, body bent unnaturally far forward, arms hanging loose like he had no control of himself. I shouted his name. It was Darren, but he didn't respond. His head tilted as if something below was whispering directly into his ear, something too private for me to hear. I rushed to grab him, pulling him back, just as his foot lifted from the deck. His skin was ice cold, eyes glazed over like he wasn't fully present. "It was calling me," he murmured, his teeth chattering, not from the cold, but from something else. I wanted to ask who or what, but the fear in his tone kept me silent. I dragged him inside, and neither of us spoke again that night. He never looked the same after that, and within a week, he requested a sudden transfer. No one argued, the veterans rarely interfered, but one of them, a grizzled mechanic named Holt, pulled me aside the next day. His eyes were sunken from decades at sea, and his voice rasped like sand scraping metal. "You were lucky," he said. "Not many who break that first rule get pulled back in time. Next time, don't follow anyone leaning over. If the sea wants them, it'll take them, and you can't fight it." His words sank into me heavier than the storm had. I realized then that the ocean didn't just threaten us with drowning. It had something far worse waiting beneath. Weeks passed, and I learned to keep my distance from the railings after sundown. Still, temptation gnawed at me. The sea was beautiful in its own way, the way moonlight shimmered on waves like scales of some enormous beast. One night, against my better judgment, I stepped closer than I should have. The darkness below wasn't empty. It moved. I saw ripples without wind, circles widening as if something enormous circled the rig. My breath caught, and though I never leaned, I felt something pull at me, a pressure in my chest, like invisible fingers tugging me forward. That night, I barely slept. The sound of waves became whispers in my dreams, voices threading together into words I couldn't quite understand. I woke drenched in sweat, feeling as though I had been standing at the edge all night, leaning forward without falling. When I told Holt, he simply nodded. "It knows your name now," he muttered, and left me alone with a dread I couldn't shake. From then on, every time I walked across the deck, I felt watched, studied, like the sea was memorizing me in case I slipped again. The oil rig is not isolated from the world, yet it feels like we exist in a pocket of reality that doesn't follow normal rules. Storms come without warning, equipment fails without cause, and sometimes shadows stretch longer than they should beneath the floodlights. Through it all, the veterans never stop reminding us of the first rule, though they don't say it aloud anymore. Instead, they watch us during night shifts, their eyes sharp and tired, making sure we don't get too close to the edge. It's less about keeping us safe, and more about making sure nothing else gets inside. One night, near the end of my first year, I found myself alone on the deck after a shift. The air was unusually still, the water unnervingly calm. That's when I saw a light beneath the waves, soft and glowing, moving with purpose. It circled once, twice, before stopping directly below me. Against every warning, I leaned closer, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The water shimmered, and I swore I saw a face staring up at me, human, yet wrong, its mouth moving in silence. Before I realized how far I'd bent forward, strong hands yanked me back. It was Holt. His face was hard, eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "You nearly answered it," he growled. "That's how it starts." He shoved me toward the hatch and slammed it behind us, his breathing ragged. That was the closest I had ever come to breaking the rule fully, and I knew in that instant why some men never came back from leaning too far. The ocean didn't just want bodies, it wanted recognition. And the moment you leaned over at night, you were no longer just looking down. Something was always looking back. I never saw Darren again after his transfer, but sometimes at night, I thought I heard him. Not his voice exactly, but something that carried his rhythm, his inflection, drifting across the waves. It called my name once, so faintly I nearly convinced myself it was the wind. I didn't dare lean over to find out, but the temptation lingered, like a hook lodged deep in my chest. That's when I realized surviving on this rig wasn't about strength or skill, it was about restraint. And restraint doesn't come easy when the ocean itself wants to know who you are. The first rule taught me something none of the others could prepare me for. The sea is patient. It doesn't need to rush, because time is meaningless out here. You can fight it for weeks, months, maybe years, but the temptation never leaves. That was why the veterans carried such heavy eyes. They weren't just tired from work, they were exhausted from resisting. And as much as I tried to deny it, I knew deep down that one day I would lean too far. The only question was whether anyone would be there to pull me back again. The first time I heard it, I thought the radio was broken. Static had always been part of life on the rig, a constant backdrop of crackling noise and half-formed signals drifting across the channels. But that night, buried deep inside the hum, I heard something unmistakable. My name. The veterans warned us with the second rule: never answer the voices in the static. I told myself it was fatigue or a trick of the mind, but the more I ignored it, the clearer the voice became, pressing against my thoughts like someone whispering from just behind the wall. At first I laughed it off with the others. We were used to strange sounds traveling across the wires, echoes from distant ships or atmospheric distortions. But there was a difference between random noise and something that called me directly. The voice didn't just speak my name, it used the same tone as my sister back home, soft and urgent, like she needed help. I froze in my chair, headset buzzing against my ear, and for a moment I nearly answered. My hand hovered over the mic, trembling, before I remembered the warning and pulled it away. The next morning, I told Holt. His reaction wasn't surprise. It was anger. "Don't ever talk back to it," he said, eyes narrowing like he was staring through me. "The second you respond, it knows you're listening. And once it knows that, you're marked." He refused to explain further, but the weight in his voice told me enough. From then on, I dreaded radio duty. Every night the static grew hungrier, the voice sharper, mimicking people I loved with perfect detail. It was as if the sea had stolen their voices and was testing which one would finally make me break. One night, Darren slipped into the control room, grinning like a child caught sneaking candy. "You're too paranoid," he said, leaning over the radio with reckless confidence. "It's probably some fisherman screwing around." Before I could stop him, he pressed the mic and said, "Hello? Who is this?" The static fell silent, eerie and complete, like the ocean itself had taken a breath. For a full minute nothing came through, until a sound like water rushing filled the speakers. Then came Darren's name, repeated over and over, growing louder with each call, until he tore the headset off in terror. He didn't sleep after that. His cabin light stayed on every night, and his eyes were shadowed with panic. By the third day, he begged the supervisors for another transfer, but no one agreed. He wandered the rig restless, glancing at the radios like they were alive. A week later, he was gone, vanished without a trace. Some said he jumped, others said he fell. But when I passed the control room after his disappearance, the headset still crackled faintly, and I swear the voice that whispered through it carried the exact rhythm of his laugh. I grew cautious, but the voices adapted. They began to mimic Holt, ordering me to check readings or equipment. Once they even copied the captain, firm and commanding, asking me to repeat coordinates into the mic. I almost obeyed, but then Holt walked in, his real voice cutting the illusion in half. The blood drained from my face, and I realized how close I had come. It wasn't just trying to lure me into speaking, it was trying to use me, to make me act on its behalf. That terrified me more than anything else. The worst night came during a storm. The rig shook with violent waves, and communication was our only tether to sanity. While I sat at the desk, soaked and trembling, the static hissed, louder than the thunder. This time, it wasn't a single voice, it was dozens, overlapping, crying out like a chorus trapped beneath the sea. They begged for help, screamed in pain, wept like lost children. My chest tightened, tears burned my eyes, and I gripped the desk until my knuckles ached. Every part of me wanted to respond, to comfort them, but I knew what that rule demanded. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the voices sank deeper, not through sound but through thought. They were inside my head now, threading through my memories, turning them sour. They whispered about secrets I never told anyone, details no one should know. That's when I understood the truth. The static wasn't interference, it was an opening. Something used it like a mouthpiece, probing us for weakness, finding the cracks in our minds where it could slip through, and the only defense was silence. Not answering, not giving it the satisfaction of knowing we heard. Weeks later, Holt admitted something over a rare drink in the mess hall. "The static isn't random," he said, staring into the bottom of his glass. "It's them. Whatever lives down there, it can't reach us directly. Not yet, but it can use the wires, the frequencies, the spaces between." His voice dropped lower. Every man who ever answered is gone now. Not one came back. The air in the room grew heavier after that, like even speaking about it too openly was dangerous. No one laughed at the rules anymore. We all understood by then. Now every time I sit in front of that radio, I think about Darren, about his desperate face, and the way the voice stole his laugh. I wonder if he jumped into the sea on his own, or if he was called back to it, following the echo of something that no longer belonged to him. And sometimes, late at night, when exhaustion dulls my resolve, I catch myself reaching for the mic without realizing it. That's when I remember the second rule, carved into my thoughts, like a scar. If I forget it even once, I know I'll never walk away. Life on the rig had a rhythm, but it was a rhythm only the sea controlled. By the time I understood the third rule, I had already lost sleep to the voices and the static. The veterans warned us next rule 3, never go below deck alone after midnight. At first it seemed like another precaution, just to keep men from accidents in the dark. The steel staircases were slick, machinery loud, and the shadows endless. But the longer I worked there, the more I realized this rule had nothing to do with clumsiness or broken bones. It was about something waiting in the dark corridors beneath. The engine levels were always loud, a constant thunder of pistons and pumps. But after midnight, the sound changed. I can't explain how, only that it felt wrong, like the machines weren't just working, they were breathing. The shadows between the pipes seemed thicker, almost liquid, and every step echoed like it was being answered. I avoided those trips whenever I could, but sometimes duty forced me. Once when Holt sent me to check the gauges at 2 in the morning, I hesitated at the top of the stairwell. My skin prickled, and it felt like someone unseen was waiting below. I carried a flashlight with me, but the beam always seemed weaker down there, swallowed by the darkness as though the air itself rejected the light. On that night, I heard what I thought was another worker behind me. Boots on the steel walkway, slow and steady, matching my steps. I called out, trying to sound casual, but no one replied. When I turned, the walkway stretched empty, my light cutting across nothing but pipes and shadows. Still, the footsteps kept going, following me, never closer, never further, just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. When I finally reached the gauges, the needle trembled violently, twitching like something pressed against it from inside the pipe. My instinct screamed to leave, to run back upstairs, but duty pinned me in place. I scribbled the numbers down, and when I turned to leave, the path back looked wrong. The walkway stretched longer, the angles twisted, and for a heartbeat, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn. Panic rose in my throat, but then I heard Holt's voice faintly calling my name from above, anchoring me. I climbed as fast as I could, refusing to look back, until I reached the deck. Later, Holt asked if I went alone. When I nodded, his expression hardened. "Don't ever again," he said, his voice sharp like a command. I told him I thought I heard someone following, but he shook his head. "You didn't hear someone, you heard it." He wouldn't say more, but his warning was enough to keep me out of the lower decks past midnight. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how the corridors had stretched, how the footsteps matched my pace, how something down there wanted me to believe I wasn't alone. Others weren't so lucky. A welder named Russ didn't take the rule seriously. He laughed about it, claiming he'd gone below after midnight, plenty of times with no issue. One night, he bet the rest of us he could go down, check the gauges, and be back in 10 minutes. We waited for him at the mess hall, counting the minutes, then the hours. No one spoke as the clock ticked on. By dawn, we sent a team to search, but Russ was gone. His tools were scattered, his helmet cracked, as if he'd dropped them mid-stride. The corridors were empty, but the air still felt heavy with his absence. The veterans didn't even look surprised. "The sea takes who it wants," Holt muttered, lighting another cigarette with a shaking hand. The rest of us tried not to ask questions, but silence spoke louder than answers. From then on, the lower decks were a place we avoided, unless absolutely necessary. Even then, we went in pairs, Always before midnight, never after. The machine still throbbed and roared, but in the back of my mind, I wondered if it was really the machinery making that sound, or if something else had been grafted onto the steel long ago. There were nights I woke to the hum of the engines, vibrating through my cabin walls, the rhythm steady, like a pulse. Sometimes it slowed, sometimes it quickened, never matching the storm outside. On the worst nights, I thought I heard words buried inside the noise, too low to understand, but too deliberate to ignore. That was when the dread grew unbearable, because I knew if I went below to investigate, I wouldn't be coming back. My only comfort was remembering the rule, clinging to it like a rope in the dark: never go below deck alone after midnight. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at sanity. Weeks after Russ vanished, I found myself staring at the stairwell again long after midnight. I told myself it was foolish, but my feet kept edging closer. I wanted to know what he had seen, what had taken him. I gripped the railing until my knuckles turned white, frozen between fear and temptation. That's when I heard it, the sound of Russ's voice, faint and broken, calling my name from the depths. My stomach dropped, and I ran before I could even think, slamming the hatch shut behind me, swearing I'd never look again. That was the night I realized the rules weren't just about keeping us alive, they were about keeping the sea's reach limited. Whatever lived down there wasn't bound by walls or steel. It found cracks in our discipline, in our curiosity, and used them like doors. I never saw Russ again, but sometimes when I walked past the lower hatches, I thought I heard him, not his words, but his rhythm, echoing faintly against the pipes. And every time, I forced myself to remember the third rule, the one that kept me standing on that deck, instead of being swallowed whole by the dark. The ocean has its own language, groans of shifting currents, distant thunder of storms, and the endless moan of steel strained under crushing depths. At first, you tell yourself that every sound has a rational explanation, but sooner or later, the sea teaches you a different truth. Rule 4. If you hear knocking from the outside hull, do not answer. It seems absurd on the surface. How could anyone knock at thousands of feet below, where no diver or vessel could survive? But down here, absurdity becomes routine, and what you dismiss as impossible becomes the one thing waiting for you in the dark. The first time I heard it, I was on night watch. The rig creaked constantly, its metal bones flexing against the waves, and I had almost grown numb to it. But then came 3 distinct knocks, sharp, deliberate, not like pipes shifting or bolts straining. It was a rhythm, almost like a signal, echoing through the steel beneath my boots. I froze, straining to hear more, and when the second set came, slower this time, I knew it wasn't machinery. It was intentional. It was calling. I didn't tell anyone at first. How could I? Holt would have chewed me out for losing my nerve, and the others would have laughed it off. But the knocking didn't stop. Some nights, it was faint, far away, just enough to make me doubt. Other nights, it was so close it rattled the bolts on the bulkhead, like something pressed right up against the hull. I never answered, not with words, not with a tap of my own. Still, the weight of temptation bore down on me, because when you're out there, surrounded by endless water and silence, any sound feels like proof that you're not alone, and that loneliness is the sharpest weapon the sea has. Not everyone resisted. There was a mechanic named Vega, tough as nails, the kind of man who fixed problems by brute force before finesse. He was the first to mention the knocks aloud. "You hear that?" he asked one night, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "It's like they're waiting for us." We told him to ignore it, to follow the rule, but curiosity is poison on the rig. Within days, he started keeping a wrench at his side, not for repairs, but for answering. I caught him once, crouched by the bulkhead, tapping back in the same rhythm. The look on his face was worse than fear. It was fascination. His lips moved like he was whispering to someone through the steel. And though I couldn't hear what, I swear something answered in kind. The next morning, Vega was gone, his bunk empty, his boots left neatly at the side, like he'd stepped out only for a moment. But the outside cameras, the ones trained on the waterline, caught something impossible. At 3:14 a.m., he walked out onto the deck, eyes fixed on the waves, and climbed over the rail. The water swallowed him without a splash, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw a pale hand break the surface and pull him under. The veteran said nothing, just passed around cigarettes with trembling hands. Holt eventually muttered. He answered. That was all the explanation we got. No search party, no calls to the Coast Guard, nothing. The sea had taken him, and by the rules, we weren't supposed to question why. Still, I couldn't shake the image of his body vanishing into the black water, as if he had been expected, as if something had been waiting just beyond the steel. After Vega, the knocks grew bolder. They came during storms, in perfect rhythm with the lightning, as if mocking us. They came when we lowered equipment, timed with the groan of chains, always mimicking, always listening. Some men stuffed their ears with wax, claiming they'd rather go deaf than hear the knocks again. Others drank themselves into a stupor, hoping the sea's voice would drown in the bottle, but silence never lasted. The ocean always found a way to make itself heard. The worst night came during a blackout. A storm rolled in, lightning, tearing the sky apart, and for a full hour, the rig lost power. No lights, no engines, only the scream of wind and the heave of waves. That was when the knocking started again. Fast, frantic, all along the hull. Not one set of knocks, but dozens, circling the station, as if we were surrounded. Some men swore they heard voices mixed in, muffled cries for help, names whispered through the steel. I almost believed it myself, because I heard my own name, faint and desperate, begging me to answer. I pressed my palms over my ears, rocking in my bunk, refusing to move. Others weren't so strong. One man, Jensen, ran barefoot across the deck, shouting, "They're alive out there. They need us." By the time we pulled him back, he was clawing at the railing, trying to throw himself into the black water. It took 4 men to restrain him, and when we finally dragged him inside, his fingernails were torn, blood smeared across the steel. He kept screaming, "They're knocking for me. I have to go." We tied him down until morning. By then he had gone quiet, but his eyes were hollow, staring at something none of us could see. Later, Holt explained the rule again, as if we hadn't already understood. That knocking ain't from people. It ain't from anything that should exist. You answer it, even once, and it knows your name. After that, you're done. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen it before, maybe even lost people to it. But he never gave details, and none of us dared to press him. The rule was simple: do not answer. The why didn't matter anymore. Still, late at night, when the storm winds howled and the sea hammered the rig like a drum, I wondered, what if the knocks really were survivors? Divers lost in the abyss, clawing for rescue. What if Vega hadn't been pulled under, but guided to safety we couldn't comprehend? That doubt gnawed at me, and the sea thrives on doubt, because once it finds a crack in your conviction, it pries it open until you crumble. Weeks passed, but the knocks never stopped. Some nights it was just one, faint as a heartbeat, as if reminding us it was still there. Other nights it was relentless, like hundreds of fists hammering the hull, and though I never answered, I found myself listening harder, holding my breath, waiting for the rhythm to form words. Sometimes I thought I understood them. Sometimes I thought they were laughing. The sea doesn't need to break down doors or tear apart steel to claim you. It just needs you to listen, to believe, to answer. That's why the rule exists, and why it's absolute. Because the moment you acknowledge the knocking, you've opened yourself to something that doesn't belong in this world. Something patient, something hungry. Even now, when I try to sleep, I hear it in my dreams. The steady tap 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 against steel, like fingers brushing the inside of my skull. I wake drenched in sweat, clutching my ears, half expecting to see water flooding my cabin. It never does. but the sound lingers, echoing inside me, reminding me that the sea never stops calling. And sometimes, just before I drift back to sleep, I catch myself tapping my fingers in reply. The sea is a mirror at night, dark and endless, broken only by the faint glow of floodlights shimmering across its restless surface. When I first arrived on the rig, I thought it was beautiful, the kind of sight that makes you forget how fragile we are out there, clinging to steel in the middle of nowhere. But the veterans warned us early on, Rule 5, never look directly into the water after midnight. They said the ocean changes when the clock strikes 12, that what you see is not always what's there, and if you stare too long, the water will stare back. At first it sounded like a joke, another one of Holt's ridiculous scare tactics, designed to keep the rookies in line. Midnight was my favorite time to sneak onto the deck. After all, the air was cooler, the machinery quieter, and the endless expanse of water almost calming. I liked watching the lights shimmer in the swells, the illusion of a second sky spread across the surface. But one night, leaning against the railing with the cigarette glow trembling in my hand, I realized I wasn't looking at my own reflection anymore. Something else looked back. It was subtle at first, a shape just beneath the rippling surface, distorted by the waves. I leaned closer, thinking it might be debris, or maybe a shadow from the rig. Then the shape shifted, and I saw eyes. They weren't human, not in the way they were set too wide apart, too still, yet they mirrored mine perfectly, watching me with an unnatural calm. The water rippled without wind, without cause, and though every instinct screamed to look away, I couldn't. It was like my gaze had been hooked, anchored by those eyes below. I don't know how long I stared, seconds, maybe minutes. Time felt strange, stretched thin. The night wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. My chest tightened, and I swear the reflection started to smile. It wasn't my face grinning back. It was something else, something pretending, pulling at my features until they no longer belonged to me. Just as my knees buckled, a hand yanked me away from the railing. Holt's voice cut through the fog, low and sharp. Don't you ever let it catch you like that. Midnight's no time for sightseeing. His grip was bruising, his eyes full of something like fear. After that night, I tried to obey, but curiosity is a sickness, and the ocean knows how to feed it. Sometimes I'd find myself drifting back to the deck, drawn by the hum of waves. I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, shapes swimming just out of focus, pale limbs reaching toward the surface. Once, I swore I saw my mother's face reflected in the water, her lips moving as though she were speaking. My heart twisted, and I nearly leaned closer to listen, but the rule echoed in my mind. Never look directly into the water after midnight. I forced myself to turn away, tears stinging my eyes as her voice lingered in the air, too real to ignore. Others weren't as strong. I remember Reyes, one of the deckhands, stumbling into the mess hall one morning, with eyes red and swollen. He swore he had seen his brother's reflection in the water, calling to him, reaching out with familiar hands. He said the reflection begged him to jump, to join him below. Reyes laughed as he told us, but there was no humor in it. By the end of the week, he was gone. His shift partner swore he'd been fine, quiet but steady, until the clock struck midnight. Then he walked straight out onto the deck and vaulted the railing. No hesitation, no scream, just silence as the water swallowed him whole. After Reyes, the nights grew heavier. The men spoke less, drank more, and when someone glanced too long at the waves, the others would drag him back inside without a word. It became an unspoken agreement. We guarded each other from temptation. But temptation always finds cracks. Some nights whispers carried across the deck, faint and sweet, luring like a song. I'd lie in my bunk, squeezing my eyes shut, listening to the creak of footsteps above as someone wandered closer to the rail. Sometimes they came back. Sometimes they didn't. One night, I woke to find Holt standing by the porthole in my cabin, staring out at the black water. His face was pale in the moonlight, his lips parted, eyes wide with horror. I whispered his name, and he startled as though waking from a nightmare. For a moment, I thought he would confess something, maybe admit that even he had nearly broken the rule. But he only muttered, "It's not them. It's never them." Then he left, slamming the door behind him. The strangest thing is how familiar the water makes itself seem. It doesn't just show you strangers, it shows you people you love, moments you miss, things you crave. Once I saw myself reflected, not as I am, but as a child again, standing on the beach with my father's hand on my shoulder. The warmth of the memory pulled at me, and for a split second, I forgot I was standing on a rig miles out at sea. That's when I understood, the ocean doesn't just watch you, it learns you. It knows what strings to pull, what memories to weaponize. Even now, I wonder what happens if you stare too long. Does the water drag you in physically, or does it simply take hold of your mind until you walk willingly into its embrace? Both options terrify me equally, because if it's the latter, then the ocean isn't just a place, it's a presence, one that waits patiently for you to slip. And patience is a predator's greatest strength. The last time I caught myself glancing into the midnight waves, I thought I saw Vega, the mechanic who had vanished after answering the knocks. His face was pale, lips blue, hair drifting, as if he were floating just beneath the surface. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, I felt his hand press against the other side of the water, palm to palm with my own. I nearly reached out, my breath fogging the glass, when a shrill alarm cut through the night. I jerked back, stumbling over the cot, and when I looked again, he was gone, but the feeling remained. Not dread, not sorrow, expectation, as though the water was waiting for me to slip again, and I know I will, because no matter how many times I repeat the rule to myself, no matter how many reminders we carve into the walls, there will always be nights when curiosity wins, nights when loneliness outweighs fear, nights when the water will look back, and I'll be too weak to look away. The rig is a maze of steel corridors, each one humming with the restless heartbeat of engines and generators. During the day, it feels almost alive in a comforting way, a man-made fortress against the ocean's endless weight. But when the sun sets and midnight comes, the comfort dies. That's when we follow the most suffocating rule of them all. Rule 6. Keep every door bolted between midnight and dawn. It isn't about intruders, not in the human sense. It's about something else, something the sea tries to push inside when the night is at its darkest. I didn't believe the rule at first. Locking doors on an oil rig felt absurd, pointless. What could possibly get inside from the open decks, aside from salt spray and storms? But Holt made it clear the first week, if even one door was left unbolted after midnight, none of us would last till morning. He told us about Carter, a technician years ago who dismissed the order as superstition. Carter left the pump room hatch unlatched one night, laughing at the warnings. By sunrise, the hatch was still swinging gently on its hinges, and the pump room was empty. Carter was gone, though his boots were still under his bunk, his half-drunk coffee cooling on the console. No splash was ever heard, no alarms went off. He just vanished. I tried not to think about Carter as I did my rounds, checking locks with trembling hands. But then I started hearing the noises. It wasn't like the knocks on the hull or the whispers from the water. This was different. Some nights, just after midnight, I'd hear footsteps pacing outside the door to my cabin. Slow, heavy dragging, like soaked boots across the steel. Other times, it was the faint rattle of a latch, as though someone was testing it, trying to see if it would give way. Once I even heard breathing on the other side, deep and wet, too close for comfort. Every instinct begged me to look, to unbolt the door and confirm it was nothing. But the rule burned in my mind: keep every door bolted between midnight and dawn. The strangest part was that the noises never came when I wasn't alone. It was almost as if the thing or things outside knew when a man was by himself. Jensen, the same deckhand who nearly threw himself into the sea after the knocking, told me once that he'd heard his daughter calling from the other side of the bolted mess hall door. "Daddy, open up, "It's me," she had whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Jensen nearly tore the bolts off before Holt pulled him away, shaking him until the illusion broke. His daughter, of course, was hundreds of miles away, safe on land. Whatever called to him had only been pretending. Over time, the rule became less about safety and more about survival of sanity. Men grew paranoid, double and triple checking the locks before midnight. Some scratched tally marks into the steel, counting the nights they survived with every door secured. Others refused to sleep at all, convinced that if they drifted off, something would slip through a forgotten hatch. The worst was when we had storms. The wind would howl like a living thing, tearing at the rig, and every bolt would rattle under the strain. In those moments, it was impossible to tell if the shaking was from the storm or from something pulling on the other side, desperate to be let in. One stormy night, Reyes, before he disappeared into the water, confessed to me that he'd made a mistake. He'd left the maintenance bay door unbolted by accident. Nothing came inside, at least not immediately, but he swore the next morning that tools were missing. Wrenches, cables, small pieces of gear. "It's taking things," he whispered to me over breakfast, eyes darting to the bolted doors, as though expecting one to swing open. "It's learning how this place works." At the time, I thought he was just cracking under the pressure. Now I'm not so sure, because I've seen what happens when a door isn't secured. One night, during my rounds, I found the storage hatch near the engine bay slightly ajar, swaying with the movement of the rig. My stomach dropped. I knew I had checked it earlier. My flashlight beam trembled as I pushed the door open, praying I wouldn't see anything waiting for me. At first it was empty, rows of shelves, crates, nothing unusual, but then I noticed the wet footprints, bare, human-like, but far too long, stretching from the hatch across the floor and disappearing between the shelves. The room smelled of brine and rot, and though I followed the prints, they simply stopped halfway through the bay, like whoever, or whatever, made them had dissolved back into the steel. I bolted the hatch with shaking hands, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been inside, walking freely among us. That night, I dreamed of doors swinging open all across the rig, of corridors flooding with seawater, of figures crawling through the halls on all fours. I woke gasping for breath, and the bolts on my cabin door were rattling violently, as though something outside was trying to claw its way in. Holt never admitted it outright, but I think he knew more than he let on. Once, after another sleepless night of rattling bolts, I confronted him. "What happens if one of them gets in?" I asked, my voice low, afraid of being overheard even though the mess hall was empty. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the door, at the thick steel latch that kept the darkness out. Finally, he said, "If one gets in, you won't see morning. None of us will," and that was the end of it. Still, questions gnawed at me. What exactly was outside? Were they the same things that knocked on the hull or something worse? Were they trying to get in to drag us out, or to replace us entirely? Sometimes, I wonder if Carter really vanished, or if he's still here, walking the corridors at night, trying every latch with waterlogged hands. Maybe that's what happens when you break the rule. You don't just disappear into the sea, you become part of whatever wants in. The thought chills me more than anything else, because lately, when I lie awake at night, I swear I hear voices outside my door. Not strangers this time, but my own. My voice, speaking softly through the steel, saying things I've never said. "Open up," it whispers, perfectly calm. "You don't need the bolts anymore. You're safe with us." And each night, the temptation grows harder to resist. They told us stories about fishing boats, and flares and navigation buoys, and how desperate people might flash for help. So when they first mentioned Rule 7, never follow the lights that swim toward the rig, I scoffed. The words landed heavier than any joke. Holt's jaw tightened when he repeated them, his fingers worrying the rim of his cup until the enamel bit into skin. That night the ocean glittered with pinpricks of glow that could have been anything: bioluminescent plankton, distant vessels, or tricks of moonlight. I learned slowly and painfully that the light out here can lie with the gentleness of a lullaby and the aim of a trap. The first time a light approached, it was a pale bead far off the stern, bobbing like a promise. Someone joked, maybe a whale with a flashlight, and we laughed too loudly, the sound brittle in the wind. I watched it curve toward the platform in a slow, measured way, too purposeful to be natural. Its path avoided choppy swells, hugging calm patches, as if someone pulled it by a cord. My throat tightened when a second joined, then a third, all circling like the eyes of hunters trying to decide which of us to notice first. Even the veterans' faces went still, hands dropping on rusted metal like anchors. Darren, who'd already been tested by other rules, walked to the railing that night and reached for his phone to record the glow approaching. "It's just pretty light," he said to us, voice too loud, the kind of bravado that covers a tremor. I wanted to tell him to step back, to remember the litany of the rig's do's and don'ts, but curiosity has a pull heavier than any threat. The light reflected in his pupils, golden and coaxing, and for a heartbeat I saw his face soften like a man remembering home. That softened look stayed on him even after he stopped moving, as if the glow had threaded a memory through him that never belonged to this place. When Holt grabbed Darren's arm and dragged him away, the resistance surprised me. Darren didn't fight. His eyes slid over Holt with a detached, dreamy patience, and the kind of complacency you get after someone tells you exactly what to do, and you follow without question. Later, in the mess hall, Darren muttered that the light had called his name and hummed like a lullaby. "It knew where I grew up," he said, voice soft and distant, and people nodded like it made sorrowful sense. The veterans refused to explain more. The rule stood like a solid, blunt instrument we could hold up between ourselves and whatever lived beyond the floodlights. The light does not always attempt to sound like a person you remember. Sometimes it imitates a pattern, rows of small, steady points traveling in perfect formation, turning slowly as if scanning the rig's silhouette for openings or for weak minds. Once, a light moved like the strobes of a helicopter searching the water, and the men who had loved the sea their whole lives sucked in a collective breath. "Rescue," someone whispered, and 3 or 4 ran to their jackets before Holt slammed a palm on the table and made a sound that was almost a prayer. We stood there, ridiculous in our fear, as the light swept past and left us to the realization that rescue sometimes doesn't want saving. I remember a shift when we trawled for a lost toolbox and found instead a ring of lights circling a patch of water where something large had disturbed the surface. The men who dived for salvage were experienced, practical, the kind who could fix a cracked valve with a coat hanger and a muttered curse. They lowered into the cold in the small metal basket, ropes creaking, and the lights closed in like curious children. One diver brushed the rail as he passed and laughed at a shadow in the sea, a bright, amused sound, and then went still. The basket bobbed as the crane operator steadied its weight, and when he hauled it up, the diver was slumped in the harness, skin waxen and eyes open to nothing, lips moving in a silent plea. We pulled the man to the deck and wrapped him in blankets, but he wasn't gone to drowning. He'd been wrenched into an attentiveness that refused to let him return fully to us. After that, the lights became personal. They didn't merely twinkle, they suggested and imitated and whispered memories through color and pattern. A pale wash that matched the yellow of my daughter's school jacket would drift by. A pulse in a rhythm my father used to tap on the radio would glow along the hull. Once, on a clear night, the lights arranged themselves into words or shapes for those who were tired enough to see them, a looping signature like a handwriting that belonged to a person lost at sea. Some men walked toward those signatures slowly, like sleepwalking pilgrims, while others clung to hands, ropes, and one another, trying to anchor themselves back in breathing, in skin. The ones who walked never came back clear-eyed. The rig's cameras caught sequences that made us all quiet for days. A crewman stepping out onto the catwalk and following a curve of light as if he were being led by a lantern, each step slow and methodical until the image cut to static. There was no splash recorded, no performance of a fall, only the camera losing its feed as the person walked out of frame into a darkness that the lens could not parse. We watched those clips in the control room until the faces around me were tight with an ache that made me want to look away, but I couldn't. Each replay taught me how cunning the light could be, its ability to calm, to make people remember, to make them decide on their own, to leave the safety of the metal hold and step into the conversation the ocean had been waiting to start. Sometimes the lights are not solitary temptations, but a chorus that coordinates. During one blackout, when the rig's emergency lights flickered and the generators coughed back to life, a ribbon of blue light rose from the water and crawled like a procession along the side of the hull. Men began to gather, a small crowd pulled to the edge, as if every mind had been asked the same polite question, "Would you like to come?" In that moment, our training and our fear held us like a held breath. No one answered. Then someone began to hum, low perhaps to steady themselves, and the light pulsed to match, like a metronome for the heart. Holt grabbed the humming man's shoulder and ripped him back into the mess with hands that left bruises and a mouth that tasted of salt and iron. When he finally spoke, that night changed us. The ones who survived those hours of coaxing came back with eyes that had learned to look down faster and hold tighter to their own names. But a whisper of the light's melody stayed lodged in my head for weeks, a tune that returned on windy nights. It wanted me to hum along and told me the rhythm of things I'd forgotten. I caught myself tapping my foot in the pattern that matched the swell the lights used, and I slapped my hand hard enough to sting. Holt's face, when he found me clinging to the rail with that small rhythm in my throat, said enough without words. The light finds rhythms, learns our weak cadences, and uses them like hooks on muscle. I tried to map the light's behavior like you'd map a fault line, note where they started, how they moved, what they imitated. Patterns emerged. They never approached when helicopters or supply boats were near, as if they respected some boundary or were shy of human gatherings, yet they were bold when the sea was alone with the rig. They favored nights when men were tired and hungry for memory. They shifted their hue to match scrap fabric on a deckhand's jacket, matched the cadence of a sailor's whistle, and sometimes, cruelest of all, they arranged themselves to mimic the shapes of faces we missed. Once, I saw a patch of light move across the water in the shape of a girl's head, hair flowing, and my hands went cold at the thought of the way those liquid faces could ask you, silently and politely, to come see them up close. When I sit now and watch the waves in daylight, the memory of light's deceit feels surreal, like a dream I might forget if I let the sun warm it away. But the sea remembers. It remembers who we loved, where we came from, and how to make us come to it on our own. That is the terrible grace of the rule. It makes the choice slippery and personal, and once the choice is made, the ocean takes whatever version of consent you offered and turns it into something final. We keep the story alive for the rookies. We mark the rule across the mess, and we watch each other, because the lights will not always have to be clever. The day will come when one of us follows them willingly, without protest, and the rig will be quieter for it. So we learn to keep our eyes low and our names loud, to sing old sea shanties at odd hours, and to move in groups when the glow begins to gather. We devised waypoints and belts and hooks to snare anyone who drifted too close to the rail. Sometimes it's a rope, sometimes it's a shout that brings a man back. And when the lights come, as they inevitably do, we do not follow. We do not let memory or longing dictate our steps. We hold our breath, we hold our hands, and we turn away from the sea's invitations until dawn claws its way back across the horizon, and the false faces of the water fade into ordinary reflection once more. When I first heard about the storage chambers beneath the rig, I imagined nothing more than metal rooms stacked with spare tools, oxygen tanks, and crates of preserved food. Yet during my second week, the crew chief leaned closer over dinner and whispered the words, "Rule 8, never enter the storage chambers after midnight." His tone was low enough that only I could hear, and though others avoided his gaze, the silence that followed told me they all knew why he said it. I tried to laugh it off, but deep down, I sensed that this wasn't just a quirky superstition. They meant every syllable. The first time I passed by the chamber doors at night, I noticed how different they looked compared to daylight. The thick steel appeared darker, the rivets almost bleeding shadows onto the floor, and I swore I heard faint shifts inside, as if something massive was repositioning itself. I remembered the rule and quickened my pace, but curiosity gnawed at me. What could possibly make those empty rooms so dangerous after midnight? One engineer once mumbled under his breath, "You'll hear them if you're unlucky," before quickly changing the subject when I asked who they were. That whisper haunted me more than any locked door. Every evening I would catch myself staring at the hallway that led down to the chambers, noticing how the lights above always flickered in that stretch, no matter how many times the bulbs were replaced. I tried ignoring it, but one night the noise became undeniable. It was faint at first, like wood shifting under pressure. Then it grew into something slower, heavier, scraping as though something dragged across the floor inside. I froze, my body aching to turn the handle and prove my fears wrong, but my mind screamed at me to keep walking. I couldn't sleep after that night. My dreams were filled with visions of being inside the chamber, the walls closing in, while unseen hands pressed against me from all sides. When I shared a glimpse of it with a fellow worker, he only nodded grimly and muttered, "The rule exists for a reason." He refused to say more, but his eyes carried a fear that words could never explain. I started to realize that breaking the rule didn't just mean danger. It meant being marked, chosen for something none of us wanted to acknowledge. The pressure built when I discovered the logbooks kept in the control room. Hidden beneath years of reports, one entry caught my attention. It simply read Chamber 3. He didn't listen. Doors opened at 12:04. Gone. There was no name, no follow-up, no explanation, just the cold certainty that someone had vanished. My hands shook as I read it, and I quickly closed the book, terrified that lingering too long on the words might somehow invite the same fate. From then on, I avoided that hallway entirely, even when it meant taking the longer route back to my bunk. Yet the rig itself seemed determined to test me. One stormy night, the alarms blared across the deck, and we scrambled to secure loose equipment. In the chaos, my assigned task led me directly past the chamber corridor. I tried not to look, but the doors stood ajar, though no one had the keys. A slow hum, almost like a lullaby sung underwater, poured out into the hall. I gritted my teeth and kept running, praying that no one else noticed the opening. Later, when I returned, the doors were sealed shut again, as though they had never moved. The others pretended not to see what I did, but that night, as we gathered for a meal, one of the younger divers trembled and whispered that he had dreamed of the chambers calling him by name. The room fell silent, and without a word, the crew chief ordered him transferred to another shift, away from the lower decks. I caught a glimpse of the diver's face before he left, pale, hollow, and almost resigned, as though he knew something was waiting that none of us could stop. I began hearing the hum more often, always just after midnight, drifting faintly through the metal walls. Sometimes it grew stronger, layered with distant voices that weren't human, but carried an almost pleading tone. On those nights, I buried my head under the pillow and prayed for morning, knowing that acknowledging the sound would only pull me closer. I never dared to ask the others if they heard it too, because silence had become our unspoken survival tactic. To name it was to invite it. The breaking point came when I woke one night to find my bunkmate missing. His boots and coat were gone, and the hallway lights leading toward the chambers flickered violently. I bolted up, heart pounding, and followed the trail only far enough to see the chamber doors wide open. There was no sound, no hum, no dragging noise, just an unnatural silence that pressed down like a physical weight. I turned and ran back before the temptation could overpower me, convincing myself he had simply been reassigned, though deep inside I knew better. Days later, His name was erased from the duty roster, with no explanation. No one mentioned him again, as though he had never been part of our crew. I thought of his laughter, his stories, and how quickly they were swallowed by the rig itself. It chilled me to realize how easily the ocean rewrote our lives, replacing memory with fear. I avoided the chambers with every ounce of will I had left, but the feeling never left me that one night, despite my resolve, something from inside would step through the doors instead. That thought stayed with me as I stood on deck the following evening, staring at the endless dark waves. The ocean was vast, unknowable, and merciless, but the chambers below were worse. They were the rig's hidden heart, pulsing with secrets none of us were meant to uncover. Every time the wind howled, I swore I heard faint echoes of that underwater lullaby rising from beneath my feet. I knew then that survival wasn't just about obeying the rules. It was about resisting the pull of what wanted you to disobey. And so, when midnight came again, and I felt the vibration under my bunk that told me the chambers were alive once more, I shut my eyes tight and repeated the rule to myself like a prayer. If I faltered even once, if I so much as touched that handle after the clock struck 12, I knew the sea wouldn't have to claim me. The chambers would. I first learned about the observation windows during orientation, when the instructor's voice faltered at their mention. His exact words were, "Rule 9, never look directly into the observation windows," and he glanced toward the floor as if speaking them out loud might summon something. At the time, I assumed it was a joke meant to unsettle the rookies, but the way the older crew shifted uncomfortably in their seats made me think otherwise. They never laughed, never rolled their eyes, just silence, like a group remembering the same nightmare. The windows themselves lined the research wing on the lowest deck, enormous panes of reinforced glass that gave us a view into the abyss. During the day, they looked almost beautiful. Sunlight filtered down in thin, wavering beams, and fish shimmered past like living jewels. But at night, when the waters swallowed all light, those windows transformed into black mirrors, reflecting our own uneasy faces. It was then that I began to understand why no one lingered near them after dark. One evening, I found myself alone in the research wing, sent to deliver updated log sheets. I tried to hurry, but my eyes kept drifting toward the glass. For a split second, I thought I saw movement on the other side, something huge, sliding just beyond the reach of our lights. I reminded myself of the rule and looked down at my boots, focusing on the sound of my steps. Still, the urge to lift my head and look again gnawed at me, almost as though something was calling silently through the glass. Later, over dinner, I mentioned the strange pull I had felt. One of the engineers froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, before muttering, "It's how they get you." When I pressed him, he only said, "If you look too long, they'll know you. And once they know you, you won't be yourself anymore." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and nobody else at the table dared add a word. The silence was answer enough. I wasn't the first to feel it. The dream started soon after. I would see the glass stretching endlessly, far larger than the rig itself, and faces pressed against the other side. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either, something between the two, eyes wide and searching. Each time I woke, drenched in sweat, I swore I heard a faint tapping on the walls around me, as though something outside was testing the boundaries of steel and glass. I told myself it was just the ocean's pressure, but doubt festered deeper with every passing night. What unsettled me most was how the windows seemed to change, depending on who looked into them. One diver admitted he once saw his own reflection smile back when he wasn't smiling, lips curling wider and wider until he fled the corridor. Another claimed he glimpsed someone he loved, long since dead, beckoning him closer from the other side. They told me these stories in hushed tones, as if speaking them too loudly would make them true again. The worst moment came during a routine equipment check. I was tightening bolts along the lower rail when a sudden thud echoed through the chamber. Against my better judgment, I glanced up and froze. For an instant, The glass wasn't reflecting me at all. Instead, I saw the outline of a figure standing on the ocean floor, impossibly still, its eyes locked onto mine through the crushing dark. I blinked, and it was gone, replaced by my pale, terrified face staring back. My hands shook so badly, I almost dropped my tools. That night, I couldn't shake the image. I tried telling myself it was a trick of the light, my exhausted brain conjuring shapes where none existed. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if the rule wasn't about avoiding fear, but about preventing contact. Maybe those windows weren't barriers at all. Maybe they were invitations. And once you accepted by meeting their gaze, you were no longer safe inside. The temptation to look grew worse over time. Each trip past the research wing felt like walking beside a magnetic field, pulling at my skull, urging me to raise my head. Sometimes I caught myself slowing down, shoulders turning slightly toward the glass before I snapped back and hurried forward. It was a battle of willpower, one I feared I couldn't keep winning forever. Some nights I lay awake, convinced that if I left my bunk, I would find myself standing in front of those windows without knowing how I got there. When the storms hit, the pressure seemed to amplify whatever lurked beyond the glass. The metal groaned, lights flickered, and shadows pressed harder against the observation panes. I never looked directly, but I could see them in the corner of my eye, shapes drifting just beyond recognition. The others refused to discuss it, but the tightness in their voices told me they felt it too. Something was waiting outside, patient and relentless, and the glass was the only thing separating us. The final straw came when a new recruit ignored the rule. He scoffed at the warnings, called them old sailor myths, and during his first midnight patrol, he stood right before the windows. By the time we found him, his body was there, but his eyes were wrong. They didn't focus, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead as if fixed on something none of us could see. He never spoke again, and within days he was transferred for medical reasons. We all knew better. After that, I never questioned the rule again. Whenever I passed the windows, I kept my gaze locked on the floor, repeating the warning in my mind. Curiosity was a trap, and the glass wasn't meant for us to use. It was meant for something else to look through. And I couldn't shake the feeling that once it chose who to look back at, there was no escape, no matter how many steel walls stood between us. I didn't believe it at first. When the shift supervisor said, "Rule 10, never respond to the voices beneath the rig." We were briefed on dozens of safety protocols, but this one was delivered with the same grave tone as warnings about pressure leaks and oxygen levels. I thought it was a superstition carried over from years of isolation at sea. But the look in his eyes was enough to quiet my laughter. He wasn't joking. None of them ever were when it came to the rules. The first time I heard it was during a night shift, when the ocean was calm and the rig seemed to float in silence. I had been running checks on the exterior valves when a faint murmur rose through the steel floor. It sounded like a chorus of whispers carried by the current, not mechanical, not natural. My chest tightened as I bent down, pressing my ear closer, and I swore I could make out words forming. They weren't in any language I recognized, but they pulsed with rhythm, like someone trying to lure me into answering. I told myself it was nothing more than the groan of metal against water pressure, but the whispers grew bolder with each passing night. Sometimes they mimicked voices I knew, familiar accents, soft tones I couldn't ignore. Once I even heard my mother calling my name, the same way she used to wake me for school. My heart clenched at the sound, and I almost whispered back before remembering the rule. I bit my tongue and ran instead, terrified of what might have answered me had I spoken. During breakfast the next morning, I brought it up, trying to laugh about how real it sounded. The table fell silent. An older engineer shook his head slowly and said, "That's how they test you. They want to know who's listening. Once you answer, you're marked." I asked what he meant by marked, but he never explained. He just stared at his plate, as if replaying something too painful to share. That silence haunted me more than the voices ever could. Soon the whispers weren't just beneath the rig, they followed me everywhere. In the engine room, I heard my name echoed in the hum of machinery. On deck, I caught faint calls hidden within the crash of waves. Even in my bunk, I woke to the sound of someone breathing just inches from my ear, whispering words I couldn't fully understand. I tried stuffing my ears with cotton, blasting music through headphones, but nothing silenced them. They weren't coming from outside. They were already inside the rig. One night, I found another crewman standing barefoot at the edge of the lower deck, swaying dangerously close to the railing. His lips were moving, murmuring something I couldn't hear over the wind. I shouted his name, but he didn't respond. Only when I grabbed his shoulder did he blink back into reality, trembling as if waking from a nightmare. He refused to speak of it afterward, but I saw the hollow look in his eyes, like part of him had stayed down there, still answering the call. The most terrifying moment came when the voices stopped pretending. I was checking the storage logs when a clear voice whispered from beneath the floor, "We are waiting." My blood ran cold. It wasn't my mother's voice this time. It wasn't any voice I knew. It was deep, layered, vibrating through my bones. My throat tightened. An instinct nearly made me reply, just to prove I wasn't afraid. But fear won, and I fled before I could make the mistake that others clearly had. After that, I noticed how many names had been erased from the crew rosters over the years. No explanations, no accidents recorded, just gone, vanished. I didn't need anyone to tell me where they went. The ocean claimed them, but not through storms or pressure failures. They answered something they never should have, and it took them where none of us could follow. Every missing name was a warning carved into silence. The longer I stayed, the more I realized the voices weren't random. They learned, they adapted. They began to sound like the people I trusted most. Sometimes they used the voice of my closest friend on the rig, urging me to come below, to help him fix something urgent. Once I even heard my own voice echoing back at me, repeating my thoughts as though mocking me. That was the night I understood. The danger wasn't that they wanted to talk. It was that they wanted me to believe. Now, whenever I hear the whispers rising through the steel, I repeat the rule to myself like a shield. I force my lips shut, no matter how badly I want to answer, no matter how much my chest aches to prove I'm not afraid. Because if I say even one word, I know it won't just echo back. It will open a door, and once that door opens, nothing inside me or this rig will ever belong to us again. The day I first heard about the final warning bell, the supervisor's voice shook, as though even naming it brought danger closer. He told me, "Rule 11, never stay on the rig." After the final warning bell, and everyone around the table lowered their eyes. I assumed it was another strange superstition, some symbolic alarm used during drills, but their silence made my skin crawl. No one wanted to describe it. No one wanted to recall the sound, and the more I pressed, the clearer it became that those who had heard it once never dared to talk about it again. For weeks, the rig seemed like any other. Storms, alarms, shifting metal, the endless groan of the ocean beneath us. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I caught the others glancing at the clocks, as if waiting for something. I would notice the tightness in their shoulders, the way they froze when the wind carried a low vibration. One evening, a senior diver pulled me aside and whispered, "If you hear it, don't argue. Don't wait, don't think. Leave." His hands gripped my arms with such desperation that I nodded without question, even though I still didn't fully understand. The first time I thought I heard it, I convinced myself it was just a faulty alarm. A deep, resonant chime rolled through the rig, not loud, but heavy, as though it came from the bones of the structure itself. Everyone froze in unison. Forks clattered onto trays, conversations died mid-word, and in less than a minute the entire mess hall emptied. I sat stunned, watching men and women I had worked beside, sprinting toward their quarters, grabbing emergency packs, preparing lifeboats. When I finally followed, breathless, one engineer hissed at me, "Don't ever hesitate. Not when the bell sounds." I asked what it meant, but no one answered. They avoided my questions with haunted eyes, muttering only that the bell wasn't ours. It wasn't connected to any alarm system on the rig. Some swore it came from deep beneath the ocean floor, a resonance carried upward through water and steel. Others believed it was something older, an ancient signal that warned of a presence we weren't supposed to witness. Whatever its source, everyone agreed. The bell meant we weren't safe anymore. The second time it came, I felt the truth in my bones. It started faint, a single chime that seemed to ripple through my chest more than my ears. The lights above flickered, and the walls trembled, as though the rig itself shivered in fear. I dropped my tools and ran, but the corridors were already alive with chaos. People pushed past me, faces pale, voices cracking with urgency. One man shouted that the doors wouldn't hold this time. Another swore he saw shapes rising beneath the waves as the bell tolled again, slower, heavier, like the ocean itself was counting down. I barely made it to the lifeboats before the deck lurched violently. Out beyond the floodlights, the sea wasn't just dark, it was moving, swelling upward in unnatural shapes. I forced myself not to stare, not to think, just to follow the others into the boats. As we pulled away, I glanced back only once. The rig's outline loomed against the horizon, trembling under the weight of something unseen, pressing against its supports. The bell rang one final time, louder than ever, and then silence swallowed everything. When we returned at dawn, the rig still stood, but the metal carried deep new cracks, as though it had survived an impossible strain. After that night, I stopped doubting the rule. The bell wasn't just a warning, it was a countdown, a signal that something beneath us had awakened, something vast enough to shake steel and stir the sea itself. No one ever explained what would happen if someone stayed behind, but I saw the empty bunks the next morning, the names quietly erased from the roster. I didn't need an explanation. Those who stayed weren't here anymore. The worst part was knowing the bell could come at any time. It wasn't tied to weather or schedules. Sometimes months passed in silence, lulling us into a fragile sense of normalcy. But then, without reason, it would sound again. Each time it felt heavier, closer, like whatever it warned against was rising nearer to the surface. Some crew whispered that one day, the bell wouldn't just drive us off temporarily. One day it would sound until the rig was empty forever, until the sea finally claimed what it had been waiting for. I've never forgotten the third time. I was asleep when it began, the low vibration crawling through my chest and pulling me awake, before the chime fully sounded. My roommate was already on his feet, stuffing clothes into a bag with trembling hands. "Get up," he hissed. "Don't wait." My legs carried me before my mind even caught up, and as we fled, I heard the bell echo again, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat stretched to inhuman lengths. The stairwells shook, the lights died one by one, and behind us came the sound of groaning metal, as if something enormous pressed against the hull. We didn't speak of what happened when we returned days later. Pieces of the deck were bent upward, twisted like tin. One of the observation windows had shattered inward, though the water pressure should have forced it the other way. And in the wreckage, we found no trace of two workers who had refused to leave, insisting the alarms were drills. Their names disappeared quietly, another pair lost to the sea's ledger. I still hear their laughter in my mind, still see their faces at breakfast, and it makes the silence afterward unbearable. Now every creak of the rig feels like a precursor. Every low vibration makes my heart skip. I don't sleep easily, knowing the bell might come again tonight, or 10 years from now. But I know one thing with certainty: I will never stay when it rings. I don't need to see what rises when the countdown ends. I don't need to know what the ocean hides in its endless dark, because survival here isn't about strength or skill, it's about obedience. And if the final warning bell calls, hesitation is death. So I keep my bag packed, my boots by the door, and my eyes on the clock. Because if the bell tolls again, I won't be here to see what follows. And maybe that's the only reason I'm still alive. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.